This is the first official meeting of the Somos Summer Fun Club. Alicia and I have gotten together and just thought through, from a few years of experience now watching teachers launch Somos in the fall for a full year, just considering, what do you need to be successful? What are the big questions and the big roadblocks that you have? And we wanted to address those over the summer so that you feel super prepared and are just in a really good brain space to tackle something new in the fall, or if you're a returning one, to just feel even more confident with what you're already doing. Alicia, do you want to introduce yourself?
So I'm Alicia Cardenas. Thank you all for the amazing birthday wishes. That's been such a joy to wake up to. I've been teaching with Somos for 5 years now, and I teach 7th and 8th grade.
We are going to be today talking about mindset. And the reason that Alicia and I chose this for our first launch of the Summer Somos Fun Club is because this is the biggest piece that is going to prepare you for success, whether or not you're using Somos. If you are switching into a new way of teaching, if you're switching over to comprehension-based methods of teaching, if you're saying goodbye to your textbook, no matter what you're moving into, shifting your mindset is going to be the most important thing to set you up for success. And 100% definitely that is the case if you're switching over to Somos. So today we are talking about getting your head in the game. And the first thing that we wanted to talk about, when you switch away from a textbook and when you're switching to Somos, even though you're moving on to a curriculum, your classes are not about the curriculum. Your classes are about connection. The connection that you personally have with your students, the connections that they have with each other, the connections that they have with the world, with different topics of study. So there is a curriculum that gives you a bit of a roadmap, but your curriculum is not the class. Your class is the connections that you're making with your students. Alicia, what insight do you have with us about it being connection, not curriculum?
So this year, I decided to make a new commitment to listening to my students and letting them. So I've always listened, but I think I truly listen to my kids. And I think this year, letting that listening and what I got from them and really being present with them and making those connections, rather than having the mindset that I have to get to the end of Unit 8 or whatever it was for me, really changed how I connected with the students and the feeling in the classroom. It also really helped me address things like kids who were at different levels, because suddenly I was just trying to connect with them and find out what they were interested in and how I could connect that to what I know, what they know, and what our target culture does. So being able to just listen and pay attention and get to know them, that's all teenagers want anyway. Mm-hmm. They want to be seen for who they are. So that was such a positive change for me, was focusing on that, not on getting to an end point. Now, some teachers do need to get to an end point so you can be in compliance, so you can reach the same point for your kids who are exiting your program or moving to a different teacher. So I think it's important to say that for Somos, you can meet both of those goals at the same time, not just using Somos, but using comprehension-based teaching. Listening to the kids allows you to meet all of the same goals. But that's a mindset shift, right? Because we're not covering curriculum anymore. We're listening to the kids.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this is such an important piece, and we see it come up all the time where teachers will post in the Somos group about like, oh my gosh, it's 10 weeks into the school year and I'm only here, where is everyone else? I feel like I'm behind. And we just want to affirm you that you are never behind. There's no place that you're supposed to be in the curriculum. There is way more in the Somos 1 curriculum, even not considering supplemental units and stuff. There's way more than you could teach ever in a year, probably way more than you could teach in 2 years. And so if you look at it, like this is the curriculum is giving you things to talk about with your students, because when you switch away from the textbook, you had things to do every day, and it's hard to then go and like have the rug pulled out under you and now like, oh my gosh, what do I do in class every day? So we're giving you things to talk about, but what we hope that you will learn to do in class is to just enjoy talking about those things with your students, and however much time it takes. If you bring up a topic and it totally falls flat and students aren't interested, forget about it. Move on to the next thing. Like try out some. If you ask a question and you don't really get any responses, it doesn't seem like kids want to talk about it, then move on to the next question. And if you see something that pops up online that that your kids would be interested in, but you're like, oh my gosh, we've only gotten so far in the curriculum, and I feel like we really should be a little bit farther. So don't forgo it. Like just go where interest is, go where your students are, to what they want to talk about.
And I think that, so one concrete example of that is card talk, where the kids draw a picture of something and then you talk about it. What if one falls flat? And I used to think that I had to spend the same amount of time on every kid's card. And then I gave myself permission to like move on if one wasn't compelling or the kid didn't want to talk about it. And that simple shift in, I don't need to spend an equal amount of time on everything, but I can listen to the kids, pay attention to what they're interested in, and move on, allowed me to have so much more fun with the kids, and then differentiate for the kid who didn't really want their work shown or whatever that was. It created better relationships and allowed me to connect with them better. So there's just one concrete example of that in one thing that you're going to see in comprehension-based teaching that will let you. So I give you permission. If something is boring, don't do it anymore. If it doesn't speak to you, don't do it anymore. If the kids love it, do more of it.
I thank you. I feel like that the permission is so important. And, I from on my end, like, I feel like, oh gosh, of course you can do that. But it needs to be said explicitly. Alicia mentioned card talk, which is basically, I think it was one of the first strategies that I ever saw used for delivering comprehensible input. I saw Carol Gobb do it when she came up to a conference in Alaska. And basically, students are drawing a response on a piece of paper. So you ask them a question and they illustrate their response. And I actually well, we can talk about this later, but one of my rules is usually like try not to use words, but my drawing, if I said, what did you do this morning? I didn't know how to draw Costco, so I just wrote Costco. So if this was my card and I said, oh, what did you do this morning? Now as the teacher, I would walk around the room and I just look for one of my students' pictures and I say, oh, Martina fue a Costco. Martina fue a Costco. And now we talk about Martina going to Costco. As long as it's interesting. If it is not interesting, if you're not getting responses, not only is it just torture for the class in general, it's going to be hard for you, but it's also really uncomfortable for the kid whose card. So like you said, Alicia, like I did feel like, oh, if I spent 5 minutes talking about one kid's picture, then I should spend 5 minutes talking about the next kid's picture. But that kid can sense that like you're really working hard to talk about it. And I think it's just a big relief to everyone, including to that student. If you say like, oh, you went to Costco? Awesome. Where did anybody else go somewhere this morning? And just move on to the next thing. So yeah, that's okay.
And
hi, everybody.
Can I say one thing? Not that I'm giving you permission. We're not giving you permission. Give yourself permission. Please give yourself permission to just connect.
We also want to talk about another mindset shift, which is comprehended, not comprehensible. So comprehensible input, that is the theory upon which all of this, upon which the SOMOS curriculum is written. The idea that we acquire language as we hear or read messages that we understand. And the SOMOS curriculum is written to be comprehensible to beginning language students. So in level 1, you start out with the unit D-Say. That unit, everything in it is reasonably able to be understood by an early learner of language. However, the curriculum as written is comprehensible, but that doesn't guarantee that that comprehensible, able to be understood material is going to be comprehended by your students as written. Because in a class where you have 35 students, or even if you have a small class of 5 students, those students are at a range of proficiency levels. They all have a unique mental representation of language in their heads. The language in their heads is different from student to student. And so it's your job to take the curriculum or take whatever content it is that you're working with and make it understood to each of your students in the room in front of you. And then Alicia was telling me she just came out of a training for the Kelso School District that she did with Lori Clark. And they were talking about absentee students. I feel like that fits in well here.
So one of the concerns that this district has is that they don't have a strong attendance, especially towards the end of the year. And even in their, level 1 and level 2 classes, kids just aren't coming to school. So they felt like they were losing kids. And then they got more and more disengaged. So it was harder to bring them back in. And one of the things we talked with them in terms of reframing their mindset was that if the kids, it doesn't matter if a kid is there or not, if you're reframing that you're not covering a curriculum, you're connecting with them. And because you have this range of abilities and engagement and interest and desire to be there, speaking so that the students understand allows them to be more engaged. So if you're making sure that they really are understanding, then you're going deep with them and connecting. Therefore, they're more engaged. So even if they miss a day, they're not missing content, they're just missing conversation.
I love that. And I that is one of the perpetual problems, I think, or roadblocks, I should say, not necessarily, not a problem, but roadblocks when teachers switch over to comprehension-based teaching, and especially when they are following a map, which is really needed for a lot of people to be able to make that transition. But what about when kids miss it? And so shifting your mindset, the way that you and Lori thought through that and phrased it, I think is so powerful that, if they missed it, they just missed conversation. They didn't miss, oh my gosh, you said they didn't miss
content.
Content, yes.
And I have to say that being able to frame that, it was really Lori Clark who helped me frame that. And I'm so appreciative because I hadn't been able to express it. And that's a place where I'm also learning, even though I was there as the trainer, like I have so much more to learn about how to help teachers succeed and then how to frame it in my own classroom with families. Because my school has a crazy attendance problem. People don't come to my school regularly. So that really helps me frame it also.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that idea of you're teaching the students in front of you and you're meeting the needs of the students in front of you. And so meeting their needs means taking whatever you plan to talk about that day and finding ways to talk about it so that the students in the room, all of the students in the room are able to connect with each other, with you, and with whatever that thing that you're talking about is.
So I'm just reading some comments. What if they miss the storytelling and your activities The next few days are based on the story asking in class. Catherine, that's such a great question. So one concrete way that I address it is I always have a copy of the story. And if I know a kid has missed the class before we ever start interacting with the story that we asked the day before, we do some kind of activity that involves reading it. So a very concrete way, they just missed the asking of it, but now we have the text of the story. So that's one way. Another way that I address it is if I have a learning management system, I have a class webpage. I post the story on there so that kids who have access and desire can get that story if they want it. Not everyone has access. Not everybody has time to engage, but that's another vehicle for them to get it. And the last piece is I'm always asking, so what if I'm story asking, what did they do? Did she want to be a unicorn trainer or did she want to be an elephant trainer? Oh, thank you, unicorn trainer. And I pretend to forget, but I also actually forget anyway because I have multiple classes and multiple sections and 2 class stories about the identical thing. And, so I address it and make sure that I'm not moving on until I'm sure they're all with me. I hope that gives some concrete piece.
Yeah. And it's never a bad idea. I mean, the idea with story asking is that you, the reason we're going to be talking about story asking in a session later this summer, a summer fun club session later this summer. And then also we'll be setting another session talking about alternatives to story asking because it really is one of the harder skills for a teacher and to develop. And so you'll see a lot of people like, oh, I don't like it. But one of the reason it's so amazing is that because when you're done with a story, because your students have come up with the details, because it's their own creation, it's their own baby, they like talking about it, they like continuing to work with it. And so when you've had an absent student that comes back, it's not burdensome to the rest of the class to say like, oh, what happened in our story? Like, let's retell our story. It's fun to retell a story, just like, if it's your own baby, like you love showing people baby pictures and like telling them about what they did. So, that's why even though story asking is hard and there's definitely good reasons to look for alternatives, it is so powerful to really try to do that so that you have content that your kids want to talk about.
We have a couple of comments. One comment is, don't absent kids miss a lot of input too? They do. There's ways around that. There's concrete things you can do. And then there's, you missed it, but come back in. I'm going to make sure that you understand what we're doing. So there's a couple of different ways to frame that depending on your teaching style, your context, your school expectations. Yeah, they do miss input. But if I'm making sure that I'm being comprehended, it's just a matter of hours that they've missed, which I can't do anything about necessarily.
And I would say that's exactly where this slide comes in. And absent kids, they do miss input. And because of absences and both real absences and also days where kids are present in body but absent in mind, that's where you get these huge ranges in what students are able to understand. And that's why it's so important that no matter what content you have prepared for your class, you go in thinking, okay, this content is reasonably able for the students in this class to understand, but I know that not everyone is going to understand it with the same amount of ease and the same rate of comprehension. And so it's my job every day, it's work as the teacher to go in and be knowing your students, looking at your students, acutely aware of when they're understanding you and when they're not understanding you, and using all of the different comprehension supports that we have to make sure that everyone is on the same page in the moment in class.
Is now a good time to just mention where those comprehension supports are, because that piece is so important. How do you make sure that students are understanding what you're doing? That's our work, along with creating the space and speaking the target language, but making sure that they understand is the work that we need to do. And it's such good work. And we have some tools to do it.
So there is a blog post, and if Sam is watching, maybe she can drop the link in the comments. There's a blog post that's how to teach such that they understand. And there's a graphic in that post, the post walks through a lot of different supports, but there's also a graphic that you can use to help. So we'll grab that and pop it in the comments for you. And then someone asked, do you ever videotape the story asking process? Yes, there are quite a few examples of teachers doing that on YouTube. I have me doing a section of story asking, but actually for our story asking session later this summer, we are going to model it. Obviously, we won't have actors and things, but we're going to model it for you via Facebook Live. So definitely, if story asking is something that you really can't catch the vision for, if you have a hard time seeing what that looks like, I think that session will be really important. And like all of these sessions, they'll be archived in the group for you to access later, even if you can't catch it live.
And to the question, do I ever video the story asking to show the kids later? I don't actually. I do it so I can share it with other teachers, so I can look at myself and do some analysis, and partially because it's not super interesting if you're not in it. I found that showing a video, there are some people who can do it and show a video and make it interesting. I'm not one of them. So I would rather give the kids the written input if they miss it, for me.
I think that I would agree with that, Elisa. I think that, yeah, it's one of those things that like you had to be there. It really is the experience, what comes out in the moment of story asking. And so paying attention to it via video afterward is maybe hard. The absent students, that is one of the problems that we're trying to solve with Garbanzo. For those of you that haven't heard about it yet, Garbanzo is the new web application from the Comprehensible Classroom, and it is aligned with Somos, but there's a lot of content in there that is not from Somos. And so that is going to be a way for you to assign texts to your students as lessons. They're interactive readings. So students will be going through the reading, and then it'll be popping up and asking them questions about the reading as they go along. And so that is one of the ways that we're hoping to support you in giving your absent students access to more input that they understand. Yes, so someone mentioned circling with balls, and circling with balls is card talk. It's the same thing. I think there just was a shift because circling with balls sounds so funny. So most of the time now, I think that we hear it referenced as card talk, but it is the same thing. And I can drop a link to what card talk is in the comments as well after the fact, unless somebody beats me to it. But we've got a blog post about it. It's also, if you own the Somos 2 curriculum, card talk is explained in the first lesson of Somos 2. Okay, so our next shift is core vocabulary, not target structures. And this is a shift that I am making with the actual curriculum as written. So when I first started writing these units for my own classes, just as a way to organize things, I was calling the core vocabulary for each unit target structures, because that's what everyone was doing when at that time, this is about coming up on 10 years ago now, with TPRS, and we would identify 3 target structures that we wanted to focus on that day. Well, there's been a bit of a ended up causing a bit of a problem because there's two different understandings or two different definitions for targeting. And targeting one would be that you are teaching vocabulary and then you're teaching it for mastery, so expecting students to understand it. And then there's targeting two, which is you're focusing on a few words, but you're not expecting mastery. And that's the kind of targeting that we've done, that I do with my students, and that SOMOS was written for. And then there's non-targeting, and that would be when you don't have any words in mind that you want to focus on for the day, and you kind of let those emerge organically. And I think because I was calling them target structures, targeting two, and because there's those two kinds of targeting, it has perpetuated this idea that you're teaching these words for mastery, and that if you get through Unit 1, your students will have acquired the target structures for Unit 1. And that's simply not the case. It's not in line with what we know about language acquisition. Just because you teach it doesn't mean students will acquire it. In fact, they say research shows that explicit instruction does not impact language acquisition. And so I'm shifting to calling it core vocabulary, but of course, there's a lot of lesson plans and there's a lot of references to target structures, so it's taking me a long time to get through it. But the idea being that when we have the set of words at the beginning of the unit that we're focusing on, those are just the words that are going to keep coming up over and over throughout the unit. And by the end of the unit, your students will probably have a pretty good level ability to interpret them when they hear them. But the expectation, the mindset shift is not that at the end of this unit, your students will 100% backwards and forwards know each of these words spontaneously in all interactions. And so we're working with core vocabulary, not target structures, even though that's the verbiage that you'll see throughout the curriculum.
And I think for me, that's such a huge mindset shift, because when I first started teaching with this curriculum, I was like, these are the targets. Yes, by the end of the unit, they will be able to use these. What I think is reasonable, that they'll be able to recognize them, but not always, because every student acquires at a different rate, and nobody has control over the rate at which they acquire. We certainly don't have control over the rate at which our students acquire, but what we can control are the messages that they get that are comprehended. So back to that other mindset, that what we say is comprehended, not just comprehensible, and that we're really keeping the words that we use to a manageable level. And for me, SOMOS has been such a great training in how to keep the words at a small number so that it really is comprehended. And then focusing on this vocabulary, but not in a vocabulary list. And I think that's another distinction. It's, again, not that these are the 3 words, memorize all of the forms. It's not that. It's just that these are the ones that we're going to use right now. And if other ones come up because I'm listening to my kids, that's okay.
Yeah, I pulled up this again because it comes back to the connection, not curriculum. So you are not teaching the words, you're teaching the students. And in every unit, there is a certain number of words that your conversations are focused around, and that those are the words that you're using to have conversations that connect you with your students, connect your students with each other, connect your students with concepts. But you aren't teaching the curriculum. You're not teaching the words. You're teaching your students, and you're using the words to do that.
Now, for those of you that are tuning in and hoping for kind of nuts and bolts, practical, so how do I actually teach this curriculum? I hope we're able to meet those needs in other pieces, but this mindset shift really is the core. And that's why we decided to start with this, because it's such a key piece, even though it's not nuts and bolts. Here's what's in Unit 1, here's what's in Unit 3. This is really the framework that seems to be the most successful for teachers in making this shift into their classrooms. So please know, we're not ignoring the nuts and bolts and the practical, like do this, not that, but it all, like everything that comes after this stems from these principles.
Mm-hmm.
So
yeah,
please don't be frustrated.
We'll bring nuts and bolts starting next week. Next week, we're going to walk through, the structure of each unit, and start to get you familiar with that. But like Alicia said, it all comes back to this. And, when you have questions and you're trying to understand, why things are written the way they are, what expectations you should have, it all comes back to mindset. And mindset isn't something that you can shift overnight. This is just a conversation that we wanted to open with you. And then, for you to keep thinking about it, and, it'll keep coming up as you stay engaged in the Somos collaboration group. We'll keep referencing these same concepts, and over time, I think just like our mindsets have shifted and are still shifting, we hope that you'll experience that same thing. Another big shift is interaction, not explicit instruction. And this one, when we decided to put this on here, I was like, oh gosh, this is going to be a little bit tricky, because if you have a really good memory and you've been following my blog for a long time, you might remember that I have blogged before on how TPRS and specifically, and then comprehension-based methods of teaching generally, are how they meet the core tenets of explicit instruction. And that was, I wrote that blog post because at my school, we had to demonstrate how what we were doing in the classroom was explicit instruction. That was the model that our administration wanted us to use for teaching. And so I actually wrote a blog post lining out how, movie talk, how TPRS, how all of these different things embody those characteristics of explicit instruction. So I did what I had to do, and yet what we are doing is not explicit instruction. Explicit instruction is that model. I do it, and then we do it, and then you do it. But just because I do in language in my classroom, so just because I model for my students proficiency, meaning that I model for them communicating about things for purposes accurately and appropriately. I'm modeling accurate language for my students. And even if we're having a conversation, I can't expect that because I said this sentence correctly, because I led this conversation with accurate language, that my students will now, at the end of this, at this lesson, be able to even just to regurgitate it back to me, but especially, not to be able to create with their own. So every class, it's not explicit instruction. It's not the I do, we do, you do. It is just constant interaction. It's back and forth and back and forth. And Alicia, you were the one that that came up with the idea for this shift that identified it. So can you explain a little bit more about what you and Lori, the conversation that you had?
Well, and this, again, really came out of conversations with Lori Clark as we were talking about how to reframe this for teachers who are new to this mindset. And the idea, again, is that I'm listening. And so I, as a teacher, need to move from a framework of I deliver instruction, I have the information that they want to learn, and then I manage the classroom behaviors in the context of this instruction delivery method. That absolutely works for other subjects, but it doesn't work very well with a comprehension-based framework because that isn't really what we know about how language is acquired. So suddenly it becomes, I'm listening to you, you're listening to me, and I have to teach myself how to listen to you and how to react and how to read. And the students need to teach themselves and really learn how to react, how to interact, because that's communication, right? It's interaction. It's paying attention. And it's something that students aren't often asked to do. They are used to being given information, interacting with it separately or in small groups, but not for, the hour or the block that we have with them. it's a different skill set. So for me, really framing that my classroom is about interaction has helped me make that mind shift. And I hope for other people and for the kids, it's such a difference that they have to work differently in my classroom.
So, Alicia, whenever I think about like pushing for having an interactive classroom, I think about students who, I love interaction. I love, I'm a super extrovert, and so I love, communicating with other people and things. But when I hear interaction, I think to most people that sounds like talking and I can't think of a different word other than interaction. That sounds really scary if I'm someone who is not, if I'm an introvert. So what does interaction look like for a student who is not super outgoing, who doesn't want to, forced to talk when they would rather just listen?
Well, I think that it goes back to this idea of what is communication. Me nodding is interaction. Mm-hmm. Me indicating my understanding. I had the great privilege of listening to Lori Clark do a demo in Vietnamese, and there is no way I can even answer yes and no in Vietnamese, but I can do this or this to indicate my understanding. That's one interaction. Now, mm-hmm. Is it students having dialogues? Absolutely not. It might be at the end of the year in a Spanish 2 or a level 3 class. Like there might be engaging in dialogue, but it also might be answering yes or no questions. It might be deciding. It might be voting by saying, yes, I agree with that. All in ways that allow the student to engage at their comfort level. And then hopefully creating a classroom community where introverts or less confident kids feel like they can communicate. Mm-hmm. I've definitely had classes with native speakers or heritage speakers who don't say anything for 2 years. And then in May, suddenly they're like, I'm ready. I'm ready to communicate. I'm ready to share. Mm-hmm. So
I think this wasn't the next slide that we had lined up, but I think that segues so beautifully into this slide of managing expectations, not behaviors. And so I'm really excited for our classroom management Summer Swim Club session at the end of the summer. And I'm going to have a big surprise for all of you. That's going to blow your minds, I think, because it blew my mind during that session. But in the meantime, we just wanted to drip this in that so many of the problems that we experience in the classroom, and then also the problems that we wrestle with, our internal and external conflicts, I guess you could say, is because we have expectations that are either not realistic or perhaps not appropriate. And so like Alicia was saying, with the expectation of interaction, like I say, okay, your classroom is about interaction. And so then, I've got to make sure that all of my students are speaking, and I've got to make sure that they're speaking to each other and that they're speaking in the target language. But, when we look at that expectation, how can we be open to that? Can we be open to that? To having a different expectation? Can we be open to interaction being a student like nodding their head or shaking their head or raising their hand, possibly because of the where they are on their path to proficiency and what they're able to help, but possibly because why would we expect them to communicate differently in a language class than they would communicate in the real world? And if their real world communication in their first language, looks like being a listener, being an observer, I don't think it, I think it's appropriate to say, like, maybe it's okay if that's what their interaction looks like in the language classroom as well. They know their first language, just because they're choosing to not be super vocal doesn't mean that they don't know it. And same thing with their second language. They're getting all the input. The language is in their heads if they're in class and paying attention. And possibly all that forcing students to interact in complete sentences or even in phrases or whatever it would be, is possibly that's just raising their stress level and making them unable to acquire language.
I think there's a word, should, that's really important, because I know when I came into my classroom, I had all these ideas of what a student should be able to do and what a teacher should do to get there. And so reframing what I can do, what I'm capable of doing, is really good for my personal, like, mental well-being, which is something we need to talk about as teachers. Is we need to care for ourselves. So leaving all of the shoulds behind for me, I should keep my kids safe. I should keep myself healthy. Those are shoulds I can live with. And then the kids should be able to do this after I've taught it. That piece. And the kids should know that when you come into this classroom, you sit and listen and don't talk over people. Well, that's an expectation that maybe isn't true in every community and every household, right? Different communities. So there's some cultural awareness. Different communities communicate differently. In my family, we talk over each other. That is absolutely part of how we communicate. And other people think it's just a lot of Mexicans yelling at each other. It's not. It's how we communicate. So knowing that every student doesn't bring the same thing in the same way, the same ideas to your classroom, is also part of that managing expectations and then setting expectations for what your classroom is going to be. So for me, in my classroom, we listen to the person speaking. We also look at the person speaking as is appropriate. That's just how it is. But then I feel like I need to explicitly teach and practice and model. And so that's where the explicit instruction comes in for me. I explicitly teach and practice and model what I want my kids to do. So that's kind of the classroom management piece, which I don't like that word. And we're going to come back to that later. The other piece is, for me, I've never met a teacher who doesn't overestimate the capabilities of their students and what they comprehend, including me. I'm always surprised at how I skipped over something really important. So again, managing my own expectations of, just because I said it once and wrote it on the board and checked for comprehension doesn't mean that it's in there 2 minutes later. And reframing that for myself is so important.
Thank you. Yeah, I agree. I think so many times I write a text that is comprehensible, or I should be comprehensible to my students, because, I know what I've taught them. I have a pretty good grasp of their English literacy. So I know like which cognates I can use and which I can't. And then when it comes to the moment of me teaching it, and I think this will be something really fast, we'll just read through it. And I start reading through it with them. And I realize like, oh, they actually need a lot of time to be able to process this and understand it. And so what I planned for this really quick reading that would just take 5 minutes ends up taking a whole class period, because we go down so many little rabbit trails trying to support students in that. So yeah, I think like you said, that, you've maybe never met a teacher who, how did you say, doesn't overestimate what their students can understand. I think that's me every time I get in the classroom with my students. And so I think it's just developing that discipline to always be checking for comprehension, and not necessarily in explicit like question asking ways, but just being being sure that you know how to understand whether your students are understanding you or not, whether it's, looking at their eyes by, you memorize that expression of cluelessness that pops up on their faces, and then disciplining yourself to be responsive to that,
and to be responsive with love and inclusion.
yes.
So I want to address the question that somebody had. Amelia said, would an admin see this and understand it? I'm guessing this is in response to this kind of communication as opposed to verbal. And I think that is some of the work as teachers that we need to do, is help admins reframe language for themselves and help them see that if they are open, and not all admins are, we know, but if they're open, that we can actually have these amazing communicative environments. We just need to manage our expectations of what that looks like. So it's also a mindset shift for them. And I have some resources that can help have conversations with admins. I'm happy to share those.
Bryce Hedstrom, I know, has quite a bit of content and expertise working. He's done the admin track at NTPRS for quite a few years.
Grown and grown and grown.
Yes, and so Bryce Hedstrom, if you have an admin who is having a hard time, I would say an admin who wants to understand but is maybe having a hard time, then Bryce is a really great resource. And then I'm sure whatever you've put together also, Alicia, is really great. When you have an admin who's not willing to consider a different thing, then that's kind of a different. I don't know what to say. That's different. That's something else.
Mm-hmm.
But if they're open, we can help. We can help them to understand. Okay, let's see. What else do we have? Yeah, we can get you connected with Alicia's resources, and then whatever resources Bryce has available online. And I want to say Lori Clark has some as well.
Mm-hmm.
I feel like Lori's like the third guest on this Somos Fun Club, but she's just not here on video. We just have been talking about her a lot. So I think,
and Lori has a wonderful adaptation of the Danielson rubric, which I've used to help frame for admins in language that they're very, very familiar with. Because what we do, if you look at the Marzano Habits of Highly Effective Teachers, if you look at a Danielson rubric, what we do in our classroom meets all of those pieces. Sometimes it's just a little reframing of, and in this class, this is what that it looks like to meet that. But it absolutely is all of that.
I'm going to jump back now. Oh, go ahead.
I will, Lori or I will put up the link to Lori's Danielson rubric adaptation. I'm just going to write myself a note here.
And I feel like whenever the Danielson rubric comes up, I always like to make a point of saying that Charlotte Danielson, right? Her first name is Charlotte, I think. She has come out and said that her rubric is not being used the way that she intended for it to be used in districts.
Yes.
So, the Danielson rubric, I would say even Charlotte Danielson at this point is not a fan of the Danielson rubric in practice. But it's one of those things, like my experience with, explicit instruction and having to support that to my administrators, that, as teachers, you do what you've got to do. And so when you know the right thing that you should be doing with your students, when you know what second language acquisition research says about how language is acquired and what that means for classroom practice, and you feel confident in that, then you can take all of these things and you can kind of play word games to keep doing what you know is right for your students. Okay, so back then, another thing, and this kind of ties in, I guess a lot of these really flow together, but another mindset shift, it is our classes are about communication, not about language targets. And the reason that I started writing the curriculum, well, I never set out to write a curriculum. I was just writing I was just teaching my students, and I was blogging, and then one thing turned into another, and I ended up turning them into writing them out more formally as units as I got those requests. And then eventually I had all the units that I had taught, and I strung them together, and now it's a curriculum. But the reason that I started teaching the way that I did was because when I first started in TPRS, it was only TPRS. That was the only thing that you did with your students. It wasn't comprehension-based methods of teaching. It was just TPRS. And when we first started, I was going from story to story, and I was using a lot of the story scripts that I found on Ben Slavick's blog. And I was using a lot of the scripts from Anne Matava's story scripts. At that time, she didn't even have the same name. She was Anne Lambert, I think. But I was using her story scripts, and we were jumping from story to story, and we were having so much fun. But I felt like once we were done with a story, we never came back to that same set of words that we had used, and we were not really moving in a forward direction. And so then I looked at, I thought, well, I want my students to be able to read a novel, but how do I do that? Because, there's all these words in the novel that my students don't know yet. And so I picked a novel. I think at the time it was Il Nuovo Houdini from Fluency Matters. And I figured out, okay, well, what words do my students need to know in order to be able to read this book? And then I started thinking, what can I talk about that's going to use these words? And how can I work through this year so that by the end of the year we can read that book? But so I had picked out language targets. I had picked out words that I wanted my students to be able to understand in order to read this book. But in class every day, then the focus was on the topic that we were communicating about, the questions that we were asking each other, the conversations we were having. So the class each day, it isn't about the words, it's about communicating. And the curriculum is there to keep you moving forward, to kind of keep you organized. But in the moment every day, it's okay if you lose track of one of those core vocabulary words, if it's not coming up. It's okay if you're not using that in every sentence. It's okay if, oh my gosh, you get to the end of the period and you realize I haven't used that word at all. It's okay, as long as you have been communicating and connecting with your students. This is connected to that connection, not curriculum. The curriculum is not about the curriculum. It's about the connections with your students. It's not about the curriculum isn't the words. The curriculum is the communication that it inspires between you and your students.
And if you're sitting there going, oh my gosh, that all sounds so wonderful, but how do you actually do it? Like, yes, you've got a good point. We want you to think about the mindset, because this is how you actually do it starts with these core ideas. Because to me, if it's not just about painting this ideal picture, because I teach real kids who have real issues, and I have bad days, and I teach with a migraine, and half the time I can't remember the word I wanted to say. And that's all okay too, because I'm connecting with them. And if you think about it and you think about some experiences that you've had and you feel exhausted by it, that's a real thing too, because it's a different kind of work, and using your emotional intelligence, for lack of a better word, to connect with people and to communicate with them, rather than I'm going to do this, and at the end of the week we're going to test on this, and and then we'll do it again next week, but with different words. It's a very different mindset, which brings us back to what we're talking about. And it is its own set of challenges. So we're hoping that by framing it this way, we're preparing you for the challenges, but also for the joys. And I think there's literally thousands of teachers in our Facebook group who will talk about the joy also that feels different. And I don't want to lose that, because you might be looking at this and thinking, this sounds really hard. Yes. And it's a very joyful process to really connect with kids, because we're all, for the most part, in it because we want to be here, right? We came here to connect at some level.
Yeah. I'm so glad that you just brought up the joy, because that was something that I was thinking about too in the car that I was this morning. I was just thinking that, man, I learning to teach this way completely revolutionized my experience as a teacher. And I always had fun with my students. I always felt like I connected with my students, but it became so much more richer when, so much more richer, so much more rich when, I let go of all of the, vocabulary words and the grammar rules and all of that I had to teach in my textbook. And it really did become just about the connections. And so, when we talk about managing expectations, I think that when teachers shift to comprehension-based teaching and they're really having a bad time of it and feeling frustrated and discouraged, I think that all points to a problem with expectations. And so all of these things that we've talked about today, if you can set your mind on these, like, that's what's going to allow you to find that same joy that Alicia experiences, that I experience in the classroom. That don't worry about how far you're getting with curriculum. Don't worry if you executed the activity exactly as I wrote the activity. If you have connected with your students and if they have understood the language that you are interacting with, then that day is a win. And I think that the hardest things really do become, I'm going to use the word management, the classroom management issues that, we'll talk about those later, but they're, those things are real, but, and they are really frustrating because it's a different kind of a classroom structure that you have when you aren't working through a textbook and you aren't tied to worksheets. But there is so much joy. It's so fun. It's so fun. I still remember just I remember singing songs with my students. I'm not in the classroom anymore. I always like to say that I'm not in the classroom anymore. I've got my own kids that I'm home with, 5 of them. And so I can't be in the classroom, but I remember singing songs with my students. Every Somos unit has a song. And I just loved serenading my students, walking around and singing the songs to them and, replacing their name for whatever in the song as we're singing it. And I remember doing stories. I remember the Una Aventura de Camping, doing that story with them. And we went around the whole school. Like, we went camping in the security officer's office, and we thought it was just the greatest thing ever. Like, we actually went in there and hid under his table, and he was there too, and had fun. And so just all those connections that you have with your students, they make it so worth it.
And it's such a great privilege to teach that, to be able to just communicate and just connect. I want to share a couple of comments in response. So one of them is, kids have to get into the same mindset because, and it's true, again, we're all conditioned by the school system. And I hold this quote and I share it as often as I can. I went to a Rick Wormelli training on standards-based grading, which, if you know me and you've been reading my blog, assessment is a huge piece for me. And I love talking about it, and I'll talk about it until the cows come home and then die of old age. But one thing that he said that I just can't let go of is that schools conspire against learning. And we are trained as teachers, and our students are trained to do this information delivery, information regurgitation. So that's what students come, the explicit instruction, and that's what students come expecting, especially students who are high achieving in other subjects. They want the list, they can memorize it, they can share it. And often they're also fast processors and can get language, can acquire language quickly, but not always. And so this is such a big mindset shift. And this goes to Jordan's question, how do we make clear for students what their expectations should be? I think we as teachers need to have a solid understanding of language acquisition, which is something else that I'm really passionate about and will be exploring throughout this and putting in different pieces. How does language actually acquire in our brains? What are reasonable expectations? And this for me is where the explicit teaching comes in. I explicitly teach about language acquisition. I explicitly teach what's a reasonable thing for a student to know. And we're very lucky to have a professional organization, ACTFL, that does have expectations that our students can meet in terms of proficiency guidelines. So we're not going to go into that, but if our students can understand questions, that's awesome. Are they going to be able to speak yet? Not after a month, not after a week. Some will, some won't. And I think it's really helping them understand about language acquisition. Do you want to add to that, or should we go back to some more comments?
No, I was going to say, just, with students coming in and understanding what the class works like, there's the language acquisition piece and what to expect from that. But also with the class being about connection, that does take a lot of modeling. But how amazing is it that for our students that have come through the class, when you are modeling for your students that the only purpose for you being in that room is to get to know your students, is to connect with them, that you are genuinely interested in their lives, and that's what you want between them as well. Like when you do special person interviews, like every student in your class is special and you want to get to know them. You want them to get to know each other. That community, I mean, you have the opportunity. It's not easy, but you have the opportunity to create that community and to shift their mindset. And that is life. There are interesting people all around you. And there are people who you might not think that you're anything like them and you don't want to have anything to do with them. And you know what? There's some way that you two can still connect. And so it is so cool that we get to create, these little communities in our classroom that do change mindsets and that can really prepare our students to go out and be world changers, not in big crazy ways, but just in the ways that really matter, with their shifting their minds and their hearts and learning to look for connection.
So, which is why I'm a teacher. That's what drove me to teaching, but it's also why I've stuck with this, is because I really do feel like I'm teaching humans at the same time I'm teaching language. There's a question about combining Somos with the textbook, and will students be prepared? Do you want to address that, or do you want me to?
Yeah, so I would say for that, there are a lot of teachers that use Somos and a textbook because they're in the same situation that you're in. And so different districts have different expectations. Sometimes you really have to teach specific things from the textbook. Sometimes it's just that you have common assessments. Sometimes it's very loose and you just have to kind of be able to say like how you were addressing themes or how you were addressing grammar. So some of that's going to depend on your specific district, but I would encourage you, whatever textbook you are using, just search in the archives in the Somos group, just pop in the textbook name like Realidades or Avancemos or whatever, and find some other teachers. You'll find a lot of them that are using the same textbook and kind of see what they're doing.
In terms of preparation, kids who are taught in an environment where they truly understand what is being said and are used to the expectation that language acquisition is slow, and they need to listen and understand, generally meet all expectations, even if they can't name the grammar pieces. Like, my kids didn't know what it meant to conjugate until the end of their second year with me. But they all knew how to say I go, she goes, and you go.
Mm-hmm.
Does that make sense? So they may not know the linguistic terms, but they can fill in the blank usually quite well.
Yeah. Yeah. And so because of that, there are a lot of teachers whose students are going on to more traditional classrooms in the next year. And I think that it is a good thing for us to be concerned about that transition, because we want to have good relationships with our colleagues. They're not going to be interested in hearing what we're doing if we are just focused on telling them about if we're not playing nice with them. So whether we're telling them about how what they're doing is wrong, or we're saying, no, I'm doing it the right way and I'm not going to waste any of my time doing grammar, it's on you if that's how you want to teach it. So there's a lot of different ways that you can, like Alicia said, your students have the language. They will have the language in their heads, and so some explicit instruction sometimes with grammar is sometimes helpful to just prepare them so that they know, like, okay, guys, you already know how to say I go, you go, with it. Like your students could say that, they could fill in the blank. And so if you give them a little bit of the grammar speak to be able to fit into that framework in the upcoming course, I think that's sometimes helpful. That's what some of the grammar and context lessons do that I have available on Teachers Pay Teachers. And then also you can look up blog posts from Alina Filipescu. She does like this grammar fan. And so she has a blog post on the TPRS for Chinese.blogspot.com blog that we can throw up to talk about that. And Alicia, you blogged about that before as well.
After spending a lot of time thinking about what Alina does and how to adapt that for my context and when I want to use the grammar. And I should say that 100% of my kids go into classrooms that are more grammar based. And it is a challenge. So I've been trying to take the feedback of what they've said, like, Senora, I wish you'd told us what the word conjugate was, because we already, know how to do it, but we didn't know that we knew how to do it. So just kind of learning as I go of how to help them be more successful as they leave me. I teach up to Spanish 2 honors, and my kids go on to 9th grade, but they go to Spanish 3 honors and sometimes Spanish 4. So they do need those words. And so that's been a growth for me this year, and I've blogged somewhat about it.
I love blogs. I love it because, like, we all kind of are at some point or another end up working through the same things, and it's just so nice that to have your experience documented, so that when the time comes and I'm wrestling with that same question, that I can use your experience to help me work through my own questions. Okay, so a few people are talking about the trainings, and I know everyone should have will have wanted to go to the training that Alicia and Lori did last week. It was a district specific one, but so if you are looking for training opportunities, Alicia is going to be at NTPRS in a couple of weeks. We
with
are
Lori.
both going to be. And Lori. Alicia and I are both going to be at IFLT, which registration might be closed for, but maybe it ends today, in Florida, in St. Petersburg in July. And then during the year, we're both around at a few different conferences, but you can always write to PD for professional development, PD at comprehensibleclassroom.com, and inquire about getting one of us to come out to your district. I don't do a lot of district trainings because I have 5 little kids that I'm home with full time, so my travel is very limited. But Alicia, she's teaching, so she's a slave to the school calendar, like a lot of you are. But she is definitely someone who has been using Somos for a long time. In her own way, I'll say, like, Alicia doesn't teach Somos as it's written anymore. That's it. She uses a lot of the materials, but she works with teachers all the time through the Facebook group that are using Somos in varying degrees. So she is a great person to come out and have work with your district. So just write to pd@comprehensibleclassroom.com, and we would be happy to give you more information about how you can get one of us, and probably Alicia, to come out. And we also have, if one of us isn't available, I know many excellent trainers, including Lori, that we would love to connect you with. And then one other thing, the singing thing. Yes, if you don't like singing, you don't have to sing. There's so many different ways to work with a song. I've blogged about it a million ways, and none of them, maybe very few of them, require you to be actually singing. That's just something that I like to do. But you do not have to sing. You can let the singer sing the song, and you can just work with the activities that are written out in the plans, or creating your own ones. Okay, what else?
Amelia, and I have to go back to my feed of comments, had a question about what do you do with kids who are new to Somos in a level 2? They've had a very traditional teaching, maybe, or she didn't say level 2, but I'm guessing, where do you meet them? And I think you and I have a different approach about how we would handle that. So I'm going to share with you what a lot of teachers have shared with me on the Facebook group, is that they've started with not Somos 1 Unit 1 and wish that they had for them. And the reason, when I've kind of dug into, so why did that work? And I know I had the same experience. It would have been easier if I just started with Somos 1. One reason is that the curriculum really spirals and really builds. Every unit adds just a little bit more and a little bit more and a little bit more. So if you start at level 5, at unit 5, and your students aren't familiar with all of the other words, it's a lot harder for them to understand it. So it's less comprehensible, and you have to do more work to make it comprehended. The other piece is that as a teacher, one of the beautiful pieces that I really value Somos for is that it's like training wheels. So it's do this, and then here's an activity to try with this text. And you start to gain this whole idea, this whole repertoire of activities and ways to interact with texts and techniques that can really help you, and they build on each other. And the third reason is that the complexity of text does increase radically from, say, unit 1 to unit 5. And if your students don't have all of those other pieces, and they may or may not. I had students in level 2 honors class who could do great work with the verb table, but they couldn't put sentences together. They just hadn't had enough communication. And so stepping back and going way back with them really helped solidify it and helped create this classroom community of shared experiences. So that's my suggestion, is start with 1 and give yourself the gift of really getting to know your students at an easy level.
Yeah, and my recommendation is usually to start with Somos 2 Unit 1, because that is card talk, and so you can really get a feel for where your students are at, and then you can go back to level 1. However, level 1 Unit 1, the DSA unit, I think is easier if you are a teacher who has never taught this way before. Level 1 Unit 1 is easier to follow than card talk. Like card talk, even you have a few different balls in the air, and keeping language comprehensible is more challenging with card talk than it is with the activities that are in level 1 Unit 1. So I would recommend looking at both of those and thinking, like, which one of these did me as a teacher, do I feel like I could really keep language, make sure that my students are understanding me better, and go with that. But either way, I think I think either way is an option, could be a good fit for you. So I would recommend going through and just reading the plans for both of those units, and then knowing that if you start with Somos 2 Unit 1, don't plan to go on to Somos 2 Unit 2. Plan to backtrack to somewhere in Level 1.
And the beauty of Somos is that you can do that. The units are numbered, but it's a guideline, not a dictate. And if you try something and it doesn't work, we're professionals. The professional thing to do is do something else, right?
Yeah.
And that's okay.
And because this curriculum, it's not about the curriculum, it's about the connection. Because it's core vocabulary, you're not targeting the structures. Let me see what else I can bring up. Because it's about communication, not about the language targets. You'll find that sometimes you'll get to a unit and you'll say, oh, my students already know these words. Like, you get to Unit 5 and you're like, TNA. And like, oh my gosh, we've been using TNA since the beginning of the year. My students all totally know that. And so there's a lot of teachers will say like, oh, there's certain units that by the time we get to them, my students already know all of those words. They have a really good handle on them. And, that particular topic for that unit isn't that interesting to me or my students. And so we'll just skip it, and that's okay. You can do that. The units are there as written if you need them, and you can teach as much or as little of them as makes sense for your particular group of students. Okay, it is 2:20, and I have 8 children under the age of 7 in my house right now. So my sister is visiting with her 3 kids, and she's curling them. So I am going to leave and go save her. But we will be back next week. Well, we'll continue to respond to questions and comments that you have, and we will be back next week for Summer Somos Fun Club Part 2, and we will be talking about we'll be walking through a Somos unit and helping you to get familiar with what to expect. Like what's the rhythm of the units, and a little bit more about the nuts and bolts next week.